When 17-year-old Princess Isabella of Valdoria collapsed during the annual Rose Festival, bleeding from her hands in front of thousands of spectators, the royal family thought they were dealing with a medical emergency. Palace security immediately called for medics, cordoning off the area as cameras flashed and rumors spread like wildfire. But what Princess Isabella revealed in those terrifying moments would expose a conspiracy that reached the highest levels of the kingdom, threatening not just her life, but the very foundation of the monarchy itself. The blood on her hands wasn't from an accident or illness. It was evidence of a secret she had been forced to keep, a truth so dangerous that powerful people would kill to silence her forever. The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone courtyard of Valdoria Palace as Princess Isabella adjusted her ceremonial gloves for the third time. The annual Rose Festival was the kingdom's most cherished tradition, where the royal family would walk among the people, blessing the first blooms of spring. For Isabella, it had always been a day of joy and connection with her subjects. This year, however, everything felt different. 3 weeks earlier, Isabella had stumbled upon something that would forever change her understanding of her family and her kingdom. It began with a simple act of curiosity. While exploring the rarely visited east wing of the palace during a particularly boring afternoon, she had discovered a hidden passage behind an ornate tapestry depicting the kingdom's founding. The passage led to a series of underground chambers that didn't appear on any official palace blueprints. In these forgotten rooms, Isabella found documents that revealed a shocking truth about Valdoria's prosperity. For decades, the kingdom had been secretly involved in illegal arms trafficking, using diplomatic channels and royal immunity to move weapons to conflict zones around the world. The operation was sophisticated and far-reaching, involving not just members of the royal family, but high-ranking government officials, military leaders, and international crime syndicates. The most devastating discovery was a ledger in her father's handwriting, detailing payments and shipments going back 15 years. King Marcus, the man she had idolized her entire life, was not the benevolent ruler she had believed him to be. He was the head of a criminal empire that had built Valdoria's wealth on the suffering of countless innocent people in war-torn nations. Isabella had spent sleepless nights poring over the documents, trying to understand the full scope of the operation. The papers revealed that weapons manufactured in secret Valdorian facilities were being shipped through a network of shell companies and diplomatic pouches. The buyers included rebel groups, terrorist organizations, and corrupt governments willing to pay premium prices for untraceable weapons. But the most chilling revelation was yet to come. Hidden among the financial records, Isabella found correspondence between her father and a man known only as the broker. These letters made it clear that anyone who threatened to expose the operation would be eliminated. The letters referenced several problems that had been solved permanently, including the mysterious deaths of 2 investigative journalists and a former palace aide who had asked too many questions. As Isabella read these documents by candlelight in the hidden chamber, she realized that her discovery put her in mortal danger. She was now the only person outside the conspiracy who knew the truth about Valdoria's dark secret. The weight of this knowledge was crushing, but she also understood that she had a moral obligation to expose the truth, regardless of the consequences to her family or herself. The princess began to carefully photograph the documents with her phone, planning to eventually reveal everything to trusted international authorities. She knew she would need irrefutable proof to make such serious accusations against her own father and government. But as she worked, she became increasingly paranoid that she was being watched. Her suspicions proved correct when she noticed that items in her private chambers were being moved slightly, suggesting that her rooms were being searched while she was away. Phone conversations seemed to echo strangely, indicating possible surveillance. Even her personal guard, Captain Rodriguez, who had protected her since childhood, began asking unusual questions about her daily activities and whereabouts. Isabella realized that someone suspected she had discovered something important, though they might not yet know exactly what. She began to vary her routines, taking different routes through the palace and spending time in public areas where she felt safer. But the stress of maintaining normalcy while harboring such explosive secrets was taking its toll. The night before the Rose Festival, Isabella made a decision that would change everything. She couldn't continue living with this knowledge while innocent people suffered from weapons her family was selling. She decided that during the festival, when the entire world would be watching, she would find a way to expose the truth. She planned to slip away from the official ceremonies and contact an international news organization that had been investigating arms trafficking in the region. But as Isabella prepared for bed that night, she found a note slipped under her door. Written in elegant script on royal stationery, it contained just 7 words that made her blood run cold. "Some secrets are worth dying for, Isabella." The message was unsigned, but Isabella recognized the handwriting. It belonged to her uncle, Prince Dmitri, the king's younger brother and head of palace security. Dmitri had always been kind to her, teaching her to ride and bringing her gifts from his travels abroad. Now she realized that his frequent trips were likely connected to the arms trafficking operation, and his position in security made him the perfect person to eliminate threats to the conspiracy. Isabella understood that her time was running out. Tomorrow's festival might be her only opportunity to reveal the truth before she suffered the same fate as the journalists and palace aide who had gotten too close to the conspiracy. She spent the night awake, finalizing her plan and trying to prepare herself for what she knew would likely be the last day of her life. As dawn broke on the day of the Rose Festival, Isabella looked out her window at the gathering crowds. Thousands of Eldorians had come to celebrate their kingdom's prosperity and honor their royal family. None of them knew that this prosperity was built on blood money, or that their beloved princess was about to risk everything to expose the truth. The irony wasn't lost on Isabella that she would be wearing white, the traditional color of purity and innocence, as she prepared to reveal her family's darkest sins. As she put on her ceremonial dress and the gloves that would hide the small cuts she had made on her palms to hold concealed evidence, she whispered a prayer for courage and forgiveness. The festival was about to begin, and, with it, the most dangerous day of Princess Isabella's life. The Rose Festival commenced with its traditional splendor as carriages rolled through the palace gates, carrying the royal family toward the town square where thousands of citizens waited. Princess Isabella sat beside her mother, Queen Elena, trying to maintain the serene smile expected of royalty while her heart pounded with fear and determination. Hidden beneath her white ceremonial gloves were small digital storage devices containing photographs of the incriminating documents she had discovered. The plan she had formulated during her sleepless night was risky, but necessary. During the flower blessing ceremony, she would excuse herself under the pretense of feeling unwell and slip away to the media tent where international journalists were covering the event. She had identified Maria Santos, a reporter for Global News Network who had been investigating arms trafficking in Eastern Europe, as her best hope for getting the story out quickly and safely. But as the royal carriage approached the festival grounds, Isabella noticed something that made her blood freeze. Standing among her usual security detail was a man she didn't recognize, a tall, broad-shouldered figure with cold eyes who seemed more interested in watching her than scanning for threats from the crowd. When their eyes met briefly, he spoke into a small microphone clipped to his collar, and Isabella realized that her uncle Dmitri had assigned additional watchers specifically for her. The festival began with the traditional ceremonies. King Marcus delivered his annual address, praising Valdoria's prosperity and peaceful relations with neighboring nations. Isabella listened to her father's words with a mixture of disgust and heartbreak, knowing that everything he said was built on lies. When he spoke of Valdoria's commitment to peace, she thought of the weapons flowing from secret factories to fuel conflicts around the world. Queen Elena presented the ceremonial roses to representatives from each district of the kingdom. As Isabella watched her mother's graceful movements and genuine smile, she wondered if the queen knew about the arms trafficking operation. Was her beloved mother an innocent victim of her father and uncle's deception, or was she another conspirator hiding behind a mask of royal benevolence? When Isabella's turn came to address the crowd, she stepped forward with trembling hands. This was supposed to be a simple blessing of the spring flowers, but she found herself looking out at thousands of trusting faces and feeling the weight of their innocence. These people believed in their royal family's goodness, just as she had until 3 weeks ago. "My dear people of Valdoria," she began, her voice carrying across the square through strategically placed speakers. "Today we celebrate renewal and growth, the eternal cycle of seasons that reminds us that truth, like spring, always returns to chase away the darkness of winter." She paused, her words carrying a double meaning that only she understood. Several people in her security detail shifted uncomfortably, and she noticed the unknown man speaking into his microphone again. After the opening ceremonies, the royal family traditionally walked through the crowd, accepting flowers and well wishes from citizens. This was the moment Isabella had been waiting for. The chaos and movement would provide her best opportunity to slip away. But as they began their walk, she realized that her usual freedom of movement had been severely restricted. Captain Rodriguez, her longtime protector, stayed unusually close to her side. "Your Highness, please stay within arm's reach today," he said quietly. "We've received some concerning intelligence about potential security threats." Isabella's heart sank as she realized that her plan to escape to the media tent might be impossible with such tight surveillance. As they moved through the crowd, Isabella found herself studying the faces around her with new eyes. Which of these smiling citizens would continue to support the royal family if they knew the truth? How many of them had sons and daughters serving in foreign conflicts, potentially facing Valdorian weapons sold to enemy forces? The guilt of her family's crimes felt crushing, but it also strengthened her resolve to expose the truth. A young mother approached with her small daughter, offering Isabella a hand-picked bouquet of roses. "Your Highness," the woman said with tears in her eyes, "thank you for everything your family does for our kingdom. My husband is serving overseas with the peacekeeping forces, and it gives us such comfort to know that Valdoria stands for justice and peace in the world." Isabella accepted the flowers with hands that shook slightly. The woman's husband was likely facing weapons that Isabella's own family had sold to his enemies. The irony was almost unbearable, and Isabella felt bile rise in her throat. She managed to smile and thank the woman, but inside she was screaming. As the royal procession continued, Isabella noticed a commotion near the media tent. Several security personnel were checking credentials more thoroughly than usual, and some journalists were being asked to leave. She realized that access to the press was being restricted, probably on orders from Uncle Dimitri. Her original plan was falling apart, but she refused to give up. Looking around desperately for an alternative, Isabella spotted the ancient bell tower that overlooked the festival square. The tower had a public address system used for emergency announcements, and it would be visible to all the cameras covering the event. If she could reach the tower's broadcast booth, she could address not just the festival crowd, but potentially a global audience watching the live coverage. But first, she needed to create a diversion that would allow her to break away from her security detail. Isabella had noticed that the unknown man assigned to watch her had been growing increasingly agitated, speaking frequently into his communication device. She suspected that he had orders to take action if she tried to deviate from the planned route. As they approached the fountain at the center of the square, Isabella made her move. She suddenly stumbled, crying out as if in pain and clutching her stomach. "I feel faint," she said loudly enough for nearby cameras to pick up her words. "Something's wrong." The reaction was immediate and exactly what she had hoped for. Captain Rodriguez and several other guards rushed to her aid, while crowd control barriers were quickly established to give her space. In the confusion, Isabella noticed that the unknown man was speaking urgently into his device, likely receiving new instructions. "I need to sit down," Isabella said, allowing herself to be helped toward a nearby bench. But as the guards focused on clearing a path and controlling the crowd, she saw her opportunity. The bell tower entrance was just 50 meters away, and the security attention was focused on the immediate area around the fountain. Isabella suddenly broke free from Captain Rodriguez's supporting arm and ran. Her ceremonial dress was not designed for running, but desperation gave her speed. She heard shouts behind her as her security detail realized what was happening, but she had a crucial head start. As she reached the bell tower entrance, Isabella looked back to see Captain Rodriguez and the mysterious man in hot pursuit, along with several other security personnel. She had perhaps 2 minutes before they reached her, maybe less. Her hands were bleeding now from gripping the concealed evidence devices so tightly, and she realized that the blood might actually help her cause by making her appearance more dramatic and memorable. Isabella burst through the tower door and began climbing the spiral staircase toward the broadcast booth. Behind her, she could hear heavy footsteps and urgent radio chatter. At the top of the stairs, she found the door to the broadcast booth locked, but Emergency protocols allowed it to be opened from inside the tower during crisis situations. As she reached for the emergency override, Isabella heard Uncle Dimitri's voice echoing up the stairwell. "Isabella, stop this madness immediately. You don't understand what you're doing." But she understood perfectly. She was about to expose the truth that powerful people had killed to protect. As she activated the emergency broadcast system, Isabella knew that the next few minutes would either save countless lives by ending the arms trafficking operation or cost her own life for trying. The red broadcast light came on, indicating that her voice would now reach not just the festival crowd, but anyone watching the live coverage around the world. Isabella took a deep breath and began to speak the words that would change everything. "People of Valdoria and citizens of the world, I am Princess Isabella, and I have something to tell you that will shock and disgust you, but that you must know." The broadcast booth fell silent, except for the hum of electronic equipment, as Princess Isabella's voice carried across the festival square and into homes around the world. Through the booth's windows, she could see the crowd below looking up at the bell tower in confusion, while camera crews scrambled to capture what was clearly becoming an unprecedented royal crisis. "For the past 3 weeks," Isabella continued, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her veins, "I have been living with the knowledge that my family, the people you trust to lead this kingdom, have been engaged in illegal arms trafficking for over 15 years. The prosperity of Valdoria has been built on weapons sales to terrorist organizations, rebel groups, and corrupt governments around the world." The sound of footsteps on the tower stairs was getting closer, but Isabella pressed on, knowing she might only have moments before they reached her. She pulled out her phone and held it up to the broadcast microphone, displaying one of the photographed documents. "I have evidence, financial records, shipping manifests, and correspondence that proves King Marcus, my own father, has been using diplomatic channels to move untraceable weapons to conflict zones. The shell companies involved include Valdoria Manufacturing, Eastern Logistics, and Baltic Holdings. People have died to keep this secret, including journalist Maria Petrov and James Morrison, who were investigating arms trafficking in our region last year." Below in the square, the festival crowd was beginning to react with shock and confusion. Some people were fleeing, others were recording everything on their phones, and Isabella could see palace security try to establish order while clearly receiving urgent instructions through their communication devices. The footsteps outside the booth had reached the top of the stairs. Isabella heard Uncle Dimitri's voice just outside the door. "Override the locks now. We need to get in there immediately." Isabella knew her time was almost up, but she had saved the most damning evidence for last. "The operation is run by Prince Dimitri, head of palace security, working with an international arms dealer known as the Broker. Their next major shipment is scheduled for tomorrow night through the port of Valdoria. Cargo manifest number VLD 7739, destined for the conflict in eastern Syria, where government forces are fighting rebel groups. Both sides will receive Valdorian weapons, ensuring the conflict continues and profits flow back to our royal accounts." The door burst open as Isabella spoke these final words. Uncle Dimitri rushed in, followed by Captain Rodriguez and the mysterious man she had noticed earlier. Dimitri's face was flushed with rage, and she noticed he was no longer bothering to maintain his usual kindly demeanor. "Turn off that broadcast immediately," Dimitri shouted at the technician who had been manning the booth. But the man, a civilian employee of the city's emergency services, looked confused and frightened. He clearly hadn't expected to be caught in the middle of a royal family crisis. "I can't just shut it down, Your Highness," the technician stammered. "This is an emergency broadcast. There are protocols." Dimitri pushed the man aside and began frantically working the controls, but Isabella realized she still had the microphone in her hands. In the few seconds before they could silence her completely, she shouted the most important information of all. "The evidence is hidden in the east wing of the palace, behind the tapestry of King Aldrich's coronation. The documents prove everything. Don't let them destroy." Captain Rodriguez lunged forward and grabbed the microphone from her hands, while the mysterious man, who Isabella now realized was probably one of Dimitri's criminal associates, moved to physically restrain her. But the damage was already done. Her words had been broadcast live to thousands of people at the festival and potentially millions watching around the world. As Dimitri finally managed to cut the broadcast feed. An eerie silence fell over the booth. Outside, Isabella could hear sirens approaching and the sound of helicopters overhead. She realized that her revelation had triggered a massive emergency response that would be impossible to contain or cover up. "You stupid, foolish girl," Dmitri said quietly, his voice filled with more hatred than Isabella had ever heard from anyone. "Do you have any idea what you just done? This isn't some fairy tale where the princess saves the day. This is real life, with real consequences for real people." Isabella looked directly into her uncle's eyes, seeing him clearly for the first time in her life. "I know exactly what I've done. I've told the truth about a criminal operation that has caused suffering and death around the world. How many people have died because of weapons you and father have sold?" Dmitri laughed bitterly. "You think this is about good and evil? This is about power and survival, concepts you've been too sheltered to understand. Valdoria is a small kingdom surrounded by larger, more aggressive nations. The arms trade has given us the influence and resources we need to maintain our independence and prosperity. Built on blood money," Isabella said firmly. "Built on the deaths of innocent people who never hurt us or threatened our kingdom." Captain Rodriguez, who had been silent during this exchange, suddenly spoke up. "Your Highness, we need to leave immediately. There are international news crews approaching the tower, and I'm receiving reports that Interpol has been contacted about the arms trafficking allegations." Isabella felt a surge of hope. If international law enforcement was already responding to her broadcast, it meant that the conspiracy might actually be exposed and stopped. But she also realized that her personal danger was far from over. Dmitri and his associates now had nothing to lose, and she was the primary witness against them. The mysterious man who had been watching her all day stepped forward and spoke for the first time. His accent was Eastern European, confirming Isabella's suspicion that he wasn't a regular member of palace security. "The girl has caused too much damage," he said coldly. "The original plan is no longer viable. We need to implement the contingency protocol immediately." Isabella didn't know what the contingency protocol was, but the way everyone in the room reacted to these words made it clear that her life was in immediate danger. Captain Rodriguez looked uncomfortable, while Dmitri nodded grimly. "Take her to the secure facility," Dmitri ordered. "We'll decide what to do next once we assess how much damage control is possible." As they prepared to escort her from the broadcast booth, Isabella realized that despite broadcasting the truth to the world, she might not live to see the consequences of her actions. But looking out the window at the chaos below, where news crews were setting up and government officials were arriving in urgent response to her revelations, she felt a sense of peace. The truth was out now, and even if they killed her, the investigation had already begun. International authorities would find the evidence she had hidden, and the arms trafficking operation would be exposed. The people of Valdoria would learn that their prosperity had come at a terrible cost, but they would also have the opportunity to build a better future based on honesty rather than blood money. As they led her down the tower stairs, Isabella could hear the crowd outside demanding answers. Her broadcast had transformed the Rose Festival from a celebration into a day of reckoning that would change Valdoria forever. The secure facility turned out to be a nondescript building 20 minutes outside the capital, hidden among rolling hills and approached by a single dirt road. Isabella had never seen or heard of this place during her 17 years as a princess, but the way her captors moved through it with familiarity made it clear they had used it before for activities that required absolute secrecy. The building's exterior looked like an abandoned agricultural warehouse, but inside it had been converted into something resembling a cross between a bunker and a prison. There were holding cells, communication equipment, and what appeared to be a small medical facility. Isabella's blood ran cold as she realized this was probably where previous problems had been solved permanently. Uncle Dmitri had been making urgent phone calls during the entire journey from the palace, speaking in code to various contacts. Isabella caught enough fragments of conversation to understand that the arms trafficking network was in full crisis mode, with associates around the world going into hiding and attempting to destroy evidence. "The shipment tomorrow night has been canceled," she heard him tell someone. "Move everything to the secondary locations and activate all the dead drops. We're going completely dark until we know how much the authorities actually have." The fact that her broadcast had already disrupted their operations gave Isabella some satisfaction. But she also understood that desperate criminals would become increasingly dangerous as their empire crumbled around them. She was now the most valuable witness in what would likely become an international investigation, which made her either extremely protected or extremely expendable, depending on who reached her first. Captain Rodriguez had been unusually quiet since leaving the palace, and Isabella noticed he seemed increasingly uncomfortable with the situation. She decided to try reaching him, hoping that his years of loyalty to her might outweigh his involvement in the conspiracy. "Captain Rodriguez," she said as they locked her in one of the facility's cells. "You've known me since I was 5 years old. You taught me to ride my first horse. You've been at every birthday party, every graduation ceremony. Is this really who you want to be?" Rodriguez avoided her eyes, but she could see the conflict playing out on his face. "Your Highness, you don't understand how complicated this situation is. There are people involved in this operation who are far more dangerous than you realize. Your uncle and father might be willing to protect you, but others won't hesitate to eliminate you as a threat." "Then, help me get out of here," Isabella pleaded. "Help me reach the authorities who can actually protect me and stop this madness." Before Rodriguez could respond, Dmitri appeared with the foreign man who had been watching Isabella at the festival. The man was carrying a briefcase that he set down on a table outside her cell, and Isabella noticed that his movements suggested military training. "We've made contact with the broker," Dmitri announced. "He's agreed to handle our situation, but he wants to debrief the girl first to determine exactly how much she knows and who else might have access to the information." The foreign man, whom Dmitri referred to as Victor, opened his briefcase to reveal what appeared to be interrogation tools. Isabella's heart rate spiked as she realized they intended to torture information out of her. But she also felt a strange sense of calm, knowing that she had already revealed the most important information during her broadcast. "I've told the world everything I know," she said firmly. "Torturing me won't change that." Victor smiled coldly. "Perhaps not, but there are always loose ends to tie up. We need to know if you made copies of the documents, if you shared information with anyone else, and what other evidence might exist that we haven't accounted for." As Victor began setting up his equipment, Isabella noticed that Captain Rodriguez was becoming increasingly agitated. He kept checking his phone and looking toward the facility's exits as if planning an escape route. She realized that his loyalty conflict might be reaching a breaking point. Suddenly, the building's communication equipment began buzzing with incoming messages. Dmitri rushed to answer, and Isabella could hear fragments of increasingly desperate reports from around the world. Interpol had issued arrest warrants for several key figures in the arms trafficking network. Bank accounts were being frozen. Shipping manifests were being seized at ports across Europe. "The entire Eastern European operation has been compromised," someone reported through a crackling radio connection. "They found the weapons cache in Prague, and 3 of our distributors have been arrested." Isabella felt a surge of hope. Her broadcast had triggered a coordinated international response that was moving faster than the criminals could react. Even if they killed her now, the investigation had gained enough momentum to bring down the entire network. But Victor seemed unfazed by the reports of their collapsing operation. "All the more reason to extract as much information as possible from our source," he said, testing what appeared to be an electrical device. "The broker pays well for thorough work, regardless of the ultimate outcome." Isabella realized with horror that Victor wasn't just working for Uncle Dmitri and her father. He was a hired professional who would continue his work even after the arms trafficking network collapsed, probably selling information to the highest bidder or using it for blackmail. As Victor approached her cell, Captain Rodriguez suddenly stepped forward. "I can't be part of this," he said quietly but firmly. "She's just a 17-year-old girl who tried to do the right thing. I made a lot of mistakes in my life, but I won't be responsible for torturing a child." Dmitri spun around, his face filled with rage. "You've been paid very well for your loyalty, Rodriguez. Don't develop a conscience now when we need you most." Rodriguez's hand moved to his service weapon. "My loyalty was to the royal family, not to a criminal organization, and certainly not to foreign criminals who threaten Valdorian citizens." The tension in the room became electric as Isabella realized that her longtime protector was finally choosing the right side. But Victor had also noticed Rodriguez's movement and was reaching for his own weapon. What happened next occurred in seconds that felt like hours. Victor drew his gun and aimed it at Rodriguez, who was still hesitating to fire on someone in the presence of the princess he had sworn to protect. Isabella screamed a warning just as Victor's finger tightened on the trigger. The gunshot was deafeningly loud in the confined space of the facility. But instead of Rodriguez falling, it was Victor who staggered backward, blood spreading across his shirt. Rodriguez had fired first, his military training overcoming his momentary hesitation. Dimitri dove for Victor's dropped briefcase, probably seeking another weapon, but Rodriguez was already moving to secure the area. "Your Highness, we need to leave immediately," he called to Isabella, while keeping his weapon trained on Dimitri. "There are protocols for this facility that will bring more of their people if we don't move quickly." Isabella was shaking from adrenaline and shock, but she managed to focus on Rodriguez's instructions. As he unlocked her cell, she could hear vehicles approaching outside. Through the facility's small windows, she could see police cars and unmarked vehicles surrounding the building. "It looks like the authorities found us," Rodriguez said with obvious relief. "Your broadcast included enough information for them to track down this location." As armed officers stormed into the facility, Isabella felt the overwhelming relief of knowing she was finally safe. Uncle Dimitri was immediately arrested, along with the wounded Victor, who would likely provide valuable information about the international arms trafficking network in exchange for medical treatment and reduced charges. But even as Isabella was being escorted to safety, she knew that the most difficult part of her ordeal was just beginning. She would need to testify against her own father and provide detailed evidence that would likely result in the imprisonment of multiple family members. The kingdom she loved would face international sanctions and investigations. The prosperity that had defined Valdorian life would disappear as the blood money dried up. As they drove away from the facility toward a safe house where international investigators waited to debrief her, Isabella looked back at the building where she had nearly died for telling the truth. The setting sun cast long shadows across the hills, reminding her of how the day had started with ceremonial roses and traditional celebrations. Now the Rose Festival would be remembered as the day a princess brought down a criminal empire, regardless of the personal cost. Isabella knew that her actions would define not just her own future, but the future of everyone in Valdoria. She only hoped that the truth would ultimately prove stronger than the lies that had sustained her family's reign. 6 months after the Rose Festival broadcast that changed everything, Princess Isabella sat in a small apartment in Geneva, preparing for what would be her final testimony before the International Criminal Court. The girl who had once lived in a palace with hundreds of servants now made her own breakfast and walked to the courthouse under the protection of international marshals. The investigation that followed her revelations had exceeded even her most optimistic hopes. The arms trafficking network that had operated for over 15 years was completely dismantled, with arrests spanning 23 countries. Over 200 people had been charged with various crimes, including terrorism financing, weapons trafficking, and money laundering. Her father, King Marcus, was awaiting trial in The Hague on charges of crimes against humanity. The evidence Isabella had photographed proved that weapons sold through their operation had been used in massacres, ethnic cleansing campaigns, and terrorist attacks that claimed thousands of innocent lives. Uncle Dimitri had already been convicted and sentenced to 35 years in prison, though he continued to claim he was protecting Valdoria's national interests. The kingdom itself had undergone a complete transformation. Queen Elena, who had been cleared of knowledge about the arms trafficking after extensive investigation, had assumed the throne and immediately began implementing democratic reforms. The secret weapons manufacturing facilities had been converted to produce medical equipment and renewable energy technology. International sanctions had been painful, but neighboring countries were beginning to trust Valdoria again as evidence mounted that the criminal regime had been completely removed. Isabella had chosen to renounce her claim to the throne, believing that Valdoria needed leaders who had never been tainted by the old regime's crimes. Her decision had been controversial among some citizens who viewed her as a hero for exposing the truth, but she felt it was necessary for the kingdom's healing process. The personal cost of her revelations had been enormous. She had lost her father, uncle, and the life of privilege she had known since birth. Several relatives refused to speak to her, viewing her actions as an unforgivable betrayal of family loyalty. Death threats from arms dealers and their associates required constant security protection that would likely continue for years. But there had also been unexpected rewards. Letters arrived daily from around the world, thanking her for her courage and sharing stories of how the end of the weapons trafficking had affected real people. A mother in Syria wrote that her son was alive because a planned massacre had been canceled when the weapons shipment never arrived. Former child soldiers in Africa were receiving rehabilitation instead of new weapons to continue fighting. Captain Rodriguez had become something of a hero himself, testifying extensively about palace security procedures and helping investigators understand how the criminal operation had been hidden for so long. He had been cleared of serious charges in exchange for his cooperation and his actions in protecting Isabella during the final crisis. He now worked for an international organization dedicated to preventing arms trafficking. The most difficult part of Isabella's journey had been learning to live as an ordinary person. She had enrolled in university under an assumed name, studying international law with the goal of continuing her fight against organized crime through legal channels. The adjustment to making friends who didn't know her real identity, doing her own laundry, and managing a budget had been challenging but ultimately liberating. On this particular morning, as she prepared for her final court appearance, Isabella reflected on how much had changed since that terrifying day when she first discovered the hidden documents in the palace's East Wing. The naive 17-year-old princess who had lived in a fairy tale world had been replaced by someone who understood the complexity of justice and the price of speaking truth to power. The courthouse was heavily secured due to ongoing threats against witnesses in the arms trafficking trials. As Isabella passed through multiple security checkpoints, she noticed photographers and journalists gathered outside, hoping to capture images of the princess whistleblower, who had become an international symbol of courage. In the witness chamber, she reviewed her prepared statement one final time. This testimony would focus on the documents that proved the arms trafficking network had deliberately targeted conflict zones where weapon sales would prolong suffering and increase profits. It was the most damning evidence against the network's leadership, and also the most personal for Isabella since many of the decisions had been made by her father. "Miss Valdoria," the prosecutor said as they prepared to enter the courtroom, "I want you to know that your courage has not only brought justice in this case, but has inspired other whistleblowers to come forward in similar situations around the world. The impact of your actions extends far beyond what we can measure here." Isabella nodded, feeling the weight of that responsibility. She had learned that speaking truth was not a single act of courage, but an ongoing commitment that required daily choices to remain honest, even when lies would be easier. As they entered the courtroom, Isabella saw many familiar faces among the defendants and their lawyers. Some looked at her with hatred, others with resignation, and a few with what might have been respect for her convictions. In the gallery, she spotted representatives from human rights organizations and families of victims who had traveled great distances to witness these proceedings. When called to testify, Isabella spoke clearly and calmly about the evidence she had discovered and the decision-making process that had led her to risk everything to expose the truth. She described finding letters in her father's handwriting that discussed eliminating problems and maintaining operational security through permanent solutions. During cross-examination, defense lawyers attempted to portray her as a naive young woman who had misunderstood complex geopolitical realities. They argued that arms sales were a legitimate business and that Valdoria had a right to participate in international trade to ensure its economic security. "Miss Valdoria," one defense attorney asked, "do you really believe that a 17-year-old girl was qualified to make judgments about matters of international security and diplomacy that experienced leaders had carefully considered?" Isabella looked directly at the attorney, drawing strength from the months of investigation and testimony that had confirmed her worst fears about the network's operations. "I believe that anyone is qualified to recognize that selling weapons to both sides of a conflict to ensure maximum casualties is morally wrong," she replied. "Age doesn't prevent someone from distinguishing between right and wrong, especially when the evidence is as clear as what I found in those documents." The courtroom was silent as Isabella concluded her testimony with a statement she had prepared for this moment. "I want the court to understand that exposing this arms trafficking network was not about politics or revenge. It was about preventing future suffering by people who will never know my name or understand the choices that were made in palace rooms they'll never see. Every weapon that doesn't reach a conflict zone because of this investigation represents lives that will be saved, families that will remain whole, and children who will grow up in peace instead of war. As Isabella left the witness stand for the final time, she felt a sense of completion that had eluded her throughout the investigation and trial process. She had told the complete truth about everything she had discovered, and the justice system was now prepared to render its verdict on the largest arms trafficking conspiracy in recent history. The trials would continue for several more months, but Isabella's role as a witness was finished. She was free to continue building her new life as a private citizen committed to fighting injustice through legal and peaceful means. As she walked out of the courthouse, surrounded by security personnel, but no longer a princess, Isabella felt something she hadn't experienced since that morning 6 months ago, when she had prepared for what she thought would be a simple Rose Festival celebration. She felt hope for the future, not just her own, but for all the people around the world who would live safer lives because a teenage girl had chosen to speak the truth regardless of the personal cost. The blood on her hands that day had been from small cuts she had made to hide evidence, but it had symbolized the much larger bloodshed that her family's crimes had caused. Now that blood debt was finally being paid through justice rather than continued violence. Princess Isabella was gone forever, but the woman who had taken her place was someone who could look at herself in the mirror with pride, knowing that courage and truth had ultimately proven stronger than fear and greed.